Hello, so we're going to continue on with the Python tutorial and we're going to talk about lists. Now I spoke a little bit about lists in the string tutorial, but I'm going to talk more in depth in this one. So let's say for example you don't want to use lists for now and you want to make a shopping list and you want to add something like milk, bread, cheese into the program so you know they're in there. So the general naming convention I guess you would choose is something like items 1 would equal, let's say cheese. You'd then say item 2, keeping the same naming convention, milk, and then items 3 will be equal to bread. And so this sort of method of storing items is quite finicky, because every time you want to reference something you have to make a new variable name to put a new value in. So let's say on short notice you have to buy celery or something, or some fruit. You would have to make a new variable name and then add in that variable to assign it. So a list just simplifies that by doing something like this. So if we say items and we use a square bracket to indicate it is actually a list, and then we put these individual items in there. So cheese, just an FYI, cheese in the UK is amazing. Like mature cheddar is just okay. So we have all these items, cheese, milk, bread, assigned to this variable, so that if we wanted to access them now, we don't have to physically type in items blah 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 blah. We could just get the index code, so we can say that we know that this cheese is index 0, this is index 1, and that's index 2. So to give you a bit more example, let's just jump into Photoshop and I'll draw you out an illustration. So in Photoshop you would say cheese, milk, and my handwriting is terrible, I can't write with the stylus, it's really hard. Yeah, so let's say you have this whole block with items spread out across it. Now we know that in this list, this is index 0, this is index 1, and this is index 2. So if we wanted to grab index 0, or let's say we wanted to grab cheese, we would then say whatever this index is, whatever this list's name is, so let's say items. Then we'll say items and reference the 0 index to grab that item, and so on and so forth. So if we jump back in, so you can see here, item index 0 equals cheese. So obviously you might want to change that list. So let's say items, you want to change that so you no longer want cheese, but you want fruit instead. So you could do something like this. Items, at the 0 index, I want to change that so that this equals fruit. And so if we look at items again, you can see how the first value has changed. Now obviously you might want to grab more items than just one. So in the same way you can, in the same way I mentioned in the string tutorial, you could do something like this. So let's say I want to get the 0th item and I want to get the first item too. By using this method, we're basically saying I want to grab the 0th item all the way up to, but not including the second item. So remember, we're counting from 0, 1, and then 2. So I'm saying I want to go from 0, 1, not 2, so just grab me 1 and 0. So these two. Now, you can also do different other variations. So like items, if you want to grab the last item in the list, you can use a -1. So that grabs the last one. You could also say something like items and then you can add some weird conventions to it. So, like for example, this one, and you can cut it off. So you go everything below the last item in the list. So you can have different flavors of this sort of like selection. Of course, and you would want to add items to that list. So let's say fruit, milk, bread. It turns out you do actually need cheese, so you want to add to it. So then you could say items dot append, so add to the end of the list a string of this type of cheese. So therefore, we've added cheese to the end of this list. Now let's say you want to insert an item. So like for example, for convenience sake, as you travel through the supermarket buying these items, you want to buy them in order, right? So fruit, milk, bread, cheese, it's fairly common that if you're buying let's say apples, it'll be close to the fruit aisle. So you wouldn't want to have something like apples at the end of the list. You'll probably have it somewhere in the just after the 0 index, so somewhere here. So inserting comes into play, and that allows you to insert items into certain parts or at a certain index in the list. So for example, if I say items dot insert and I give an index here of 1, so I want it to be placed in the first index, not the 0th index, the first index, and I want an item of apples to be there. So if we have a look at items, you can see how we've now appended, well, I wouldn't say appended, how we've placed apples into the list, and we've managed to move every item in the list up by 1. So what would otherwise be their index code then, now we have this as 0, this as 1, this as 2, 3 and 4. So their index value has now changed to 2. Now, let's say you have another list. Let's say you need to buy... Actually, let's just call this extra. So, let's say we want to buy extra items, not necessarily food related, something like dog. I can't think of something else I would want to buy. Let's say tape. Yeah, tape. So DIY tools, DIY stuff. So that hammer. Yeah, that's good enough. And we want to add these two items to our list so we know what to buy. So we could say something like, we can append these lists together in the same way we had strings concatenated. So we could say items plus extra, and you can see how these two lists have joined together, and you can see how the extra bit has been added to the end. Now something like would not work, because you have to make sure they are the same type. And so if you wanted to, let's say, add an individual string, you would have to cast that to the same type. Also, let's say you wanted to get the length of a string. Now, so you want to find out the number of items in your list. So we know that items is this many items, and we want to find the length, because counting each individual item would just be pointless. Imagine you had a list of 200 items. Counting it would take up a bit of your time, so nobody has time for that. So what you would use is a length function. So just len, and then you type in the length of, you type in the list you have, and that will output the length of your list. Now finally, let's say you want to do a check on your item, or you wanted to do a check on your list. So for example, I want to check if my list has fruit in it. I don't know if I've added it to my list already. I don't know if I need to add it again. So what you could do is something like is fruit in items, and that returns you a true or false statement, so that if it is in items, it returns a true, and if it's not, so let's say is orange in items false. Obviously there's no orange there, so therefore it returns a false to us. So I think that covers everything for lists for now. The same sort of thing can be done for numbers. So let's say I wanted to make a list of numbers. So we could say items, and let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and items, you can have items there, and numbers. So the same sort of variation can take place. You can use the same in operator, you can insert at a particular point, you can append, you can do the selection, custom selecting here. The same sort of things apply. So I think that covers this tutorial. I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.